Hello everyone, welcome to EUB104, part 1 of our week 9 seminar. We will be looking at engaging with pedagogy. Pedagogy is often confused with curriculum. So curriculum defines what is being taught, while pedagogy actually refers to the method in how we teach, so the theory and the practice of educating. Pedagogy is more than knowledge transmission, where the teacher deposits knowledge in the students who then draw upon this knowledge as required. Rather, pedagogy, it describes the what, the why, and the how of teachers' practice. Allen and White, so your textbook, they emphasise that teachers should base their decisions on how to teach on their understandings of how individual students learn. So in other words, pedagogy is how a teacher draws this enigmatic link between teaching and learning. The relationship between teaching and learning, it comprises of 3 elements: the student, the teacher, and the content being learnt. Each student has unique factors that influence how they think, how they feel, and act, developing at different rates, learning in different ways, and having very different dispositions, interests, inspirations, and of course, life stories. Teachers need to have a very good understandings of individual students and how they learn. So they need to be able to do this to make informed decisions around their choices about their approaches. Critical actions and decisions made in learning environments, these are based on these understandings of students and also the careful observation of that interaction between teaching and learning. So once teachers have a good understanding of their students and the subject content that's chosen to be taught, they are very well positioned to then make decisions about the strategies, the approaches, and the methods that will influence the teaching and learning process. Effective teaching requires that teachers research, possess, and implement a repertoire of pedagogical approaches. So there's no single effective approach. Rather, there's a need for a balance of approaches to support individual students and contexts. So in this first part of the lecture, we're going to explore 4 different pedagogies, but you're actually going to become familiar with many, many more over the course of your studies and moving into your teaching career. In 21st century teaching and learning, the term pedagogy, it not only refers to our strategies, styles, or approaches to teaching, but also to the ability to manage transformations. So whether individual, social, structural, or institutional. So to adapt our pedagogy to circumstances as they unfold. So our current climate is a perfect example of teachers needing to adapt their practices and their approaches to support their students' learning. So within their diverse contexts and situations, and also recognising any social inequities that might impact their learning. Some students, for example, they may not have access to devices. So teachers are finding that they're needing to send home individual learning packages. So adapting their practices for individual students. During this pandemic, as well as needing to be reflective, adaptive, collaborative, and of course resilient, teachers are actually reinventing what best practice is in their individual contexts. As Brunner, Dewey, and Schwab first noted decades ago, school curriculum content is knowledge from multiple disciplines. So knowledge that's been translated to and transformed within social contexts, especially schooling. Given its disciplinary roots, knowledge for effective teaching within each curriculum-based content area is similarly differentiated. Knowing how to teach secondary school maths, for example, requires quite dramatically different approaches to how to teach prep reading or upper primary social sciences. This specialised professional knowledge is what Schulman 1986 termed pedagogical content knowledge. In part, the discipline-specific knowledge necessary to teach effectively in each different content area. Schulman contends that the teaching process requires teachers to critically reflect on their subject knowledge, adapting and tailoring the content to make it accessible to specific student demographic. So considering gender, age, learning preference, and also things like prior knowledge. He proposed moving away from a model where teaching was telling and learning was listening. Mishra and Kohler, 2006, they've extended the construct of pedagogical content knowledge to include the technological knowledge necessary to teach effectively with digital tools and resources, so across different content areas. This was partly in the response to the Bring Your Own Device initiative, the overt use of ICT in the Australian professional standards, as well as it being a general capability in the Australian curriculum. So TPAC, it gives us 3 knowledge areas to consider: technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge. Arranging these 3 categories in a Venn diagram, as you can see on the slide, it helps us to see the 4 areas that are created by Mishra and Kohler's framework. This was introduced and unpacked in EUB101, so supporting innovative pedagogy with digital technologies. So in the unit, you would have discussed a lot of ways to use technology in learning environments. The TPAC model, it gives us a new framework for the integration of technology in education and how we can actually structure 21st century learning environments to provide the best educational experience for students while incorporating technology. An example of different approaches to delivering content knowledge, an example might be looking at the concept of fractions. So you can see the different strategies used to teach this concept. So from concrete materials to more abstract thinking, gamification, to particular strategies or techniques to help analysing and visual conceptualizations. As a teacher, you will make decisions about how you go about teaching concepts to your learners. So pedagogical content knowledge stresses that you choose not only the pedagogy that matches the content, but overlaying what pedagogy matches the students' life worlds, their interests, and of course their learning dispositions. So knowing there is no one way and that it may require a combination of pedagogical approaches to teach children and students. This is really important. So this means that teachers base the choice of teaching strategies on specific content knowledge, in addition to taking into consideration the age and developmental stage of the learner. So on the slide, you can see 5 PCK strategies outlined by Churchill et al. So, for example, in the content of EUB104, Jen provided a range of meaningful examples, demonstrations, and also provocations to support your reflection and learning, as well as offering, analysing, and visual conceptualizations. So you can see some examples of those on the slide that we used in our learning forums. Social constructivism suggests that human development is significantly influenced by social factors and that knowledge and life skills are constructed when interacting with others. So, collaborative pedagogy, if implemented effectively, can provide children and students with the opportunity to develop important teamwork skills. And it also can work to alleviate student isolation in the learning environment. It allows teachers to provide more variety in their instruction, and it can also be used to complement other strategies. It can take the form of highly structured and directed group work or more student-directed cooperative learning. It is a student-centred approach, encouraging the use of independent learning strategies, but the teacher's role, of course, is crucial for it to be effective. It also encourages peer teaching and feedback. Importantly, it can help students to clarify ideas and understandings through discussion. So much like the think, pair, share strategies we use in our face-to-face classes and also our breakout groups online. So it's an approach that encourages the development of critical thinking skills. So this is done through listening and debating with other students. In this way, it also promotes higher level thinking and also communication skills through the sharing of each other's perspectives. Looking at an EUB104 activity as an example, when you worked in small groups to construct your cells in the Minecraft chess activity, was this a collaborative pedagogy strategy in use or not? So were you actually working together in groups? I would say not, but I think with lots of scaffolding, you could build it to make it more collaborative. It's important to remember that working together to break down and delegate responsibilities, it's one of the most challenging tasks for any groups, for even adults. So some really important factors need to be considered when we're planning and organising group work. So for collaborative pedagogies to be effective, it's important to acknowledge that it goes beyond students getting into groups like we did in the Minecraft activity. Students need to work as a group, not just in a group. To move towards this level of collaboration, you would really need to scaffold students' cooperative learning over time. So discuss and set expectations for cooperative group work. So this is best done collaboratively and reinforced in the learning environment regularly. So to be a positive experience, this requires planning with clear aims and guidelines, including things like group size and choices about group composition. So the aims and considerations when working in small groups, they include things like good communication, of course, cooperation, and importantly, teamwork skills. So things like listening, planning, leadership skills, goal setting, accountability, conflict management, things like understanding democratic processes, so being willing to cooperate with others on their ideas, keeping an open mind, and of course, having respect for diversity and difference. This is really important in establishing a positive learning environment. So these cooperative learning skills and considerations, they don't just happen. They need to be taught over time. And sometimes group work, it is avoided by many teachers because it really does take a great deal of effort and planning. And it's something that as a beginning teacher, you really need to work towards. You really need to develop those skills over time. Explicit instruction. So this is a way to teach skills or concepts to students using direct, structured instruction. So it helps make lessons clear by modelling for students how to start and how to succeed on a task, and also making sure that you give them plenty of time to practice. So it's like thinking aloud so that learners can hear the processes involved in your own thinking. It involves things like establishing predictable and purposeful routines and transitions so that learners are confident about what to expect. It's about explaining expectations explicitly. It's about modelling new skills that may be required to complete learning tasks. Providing feedback that allows young learners the thinking time necessary to generate a response to a problem, so just-in-time feedback. It's about ensuring that feedback is specific and supportive. It's also about ensuring that young learners are aware of the resources that they can use to solve a problem. Whether it's about accessing materials, using specific language, or seeking a request to help. Or it could be the use of visual cues to help, such as using a word wall or a learning wall in the learning environment. So this pedagogy has had a big influence on teacher planning. So for example, you're going to see this in your placements. The use of explicit instruction, it often takes the form of learning intentions and success criteria displayed and discussed in the learning environment. So Walt, we are learning to. This is all about outlining the objectives of the lesson. Wilf, what I'm looking for, and you might come across Tib, this is because. You could also come across Waggle, so what a good one looks like. This is usually a collection of work samples, so exemplary work that teachers share. Students, they're often encouraged to refer to the Waggle while assessing their own work or even providing feedback to their peers' work. Another model that you're going to see during placement, gradual release of responsibility. This suggests that cognitive work should shift slowly and intentionally from the teacher modelling to joint responsibility between teachers and students, and then to independent practice and application by the learner. So you're going to hear this referred to during placement as I do, we do, and you do. Many of you will have used this as students yourselves in your classrooms. So in this Eitzel clip, the teacher focuses on developing a positive learning environment with high expectations for success with his students. I want you to note how he models the learning processes for students by using the I do, we do, you do strategy, and how he emphasizes the importance of providing students with purposeful and understandable feedback to support achievement. You'll also notice that in the you do phase, the teacher uses an online resource to differentiate teaching to meet the individual student's strengths and needs. So I want you to pause the recording here and reflect on how he uses explicit instruction to support individual students. So some examples from EUB104 for you to relate to. In terms of I do, Jen discussed and demonstrated and also unpacked an example of a reflection. Students' needs were also differentiated through student success group workshops and also the frequently asked questions Padlet. We do. So you have a go, you had a go of the first stage reflection based on the example, then you do it together, have another go, and then bring it in to receive peer feedback and tutor feedback. And then finally you do it alone, of course, completing the assessment task. So this would be with reference to the task sheet and also the marking criteria sheet or the rubric. So moving on to critical pedagogy. Critical pedagogy isn't a prescriptive set of practices like those that we've unpacked so far. It actually centers on the notion of empowering students to challenge assumptions. So to move away from those transmissive, passive acceptance of information and understandings to actively and to also critically question what they hear and see. So, this pedagogy connects classroom learning with the experiences, with the histories, and also the resources that every student brings into their learning environment. Importantly, it allows students to understand that with knowledge comes power. So, the power that can enable young people to do something differently in their moment in time, and also to take positive and constructive action in their environments. As a teacher, these critical skills can be encouraged by fostering progressive ideals. So, things like the fight against racism, sexism, it could be questioning income equality, and also instilling values of social justice. As a teacher, you might do it as we did in EUB104 by looking for underlying messages or biases in popular culture and across mass media, for example. So creating an open and accepting culture in the learning environment is a really important place to focus on, a good place to start. It's also important to acknowledge that decisions on what to teach and how to teach, they're political decisions. So there's an ethical and moral dimension that needs to be considered in these choices and decisions that you make. And I guess, like many decisions in the learning environment, we need to carefully take context and personal bias into consideration when making these choices and decisions. So I've got the image of the film Dead Poets Society up on the slide. So in this film, Professor John Keating, who's played by Robin Williams, he encourages his students to do things like rip up their textbooks and throw them away. It's set in a traditional, very conservative university in the late 1950s, and it tells a story of how a teacher encourages his students to seize the day, to make the most out of their own education, through rejecting their school traditions and thinking for themselves. So, very controversial in that point in time in the film. So, this film, it's actually cited by some as a really good exemplar of the philosophy of critical pedagogy in the classroom. And it's well worth a look if you haven't seen it, because it really does focus on that transformation aspect of critical pedagogy. So I want to talk about an example of critical pedagogy in the early years to start with. So teachers need to critically reflect and understand and I guess question their resource selection and use. So considering the diversity of the community, to ensure that the environment reflects the children and the families, so their world stories, their actual context, who they are, their family makeup. If we look, for example, at the common use of animal figurines in early years environments, they come in a pack of 4, so with mum, dad, and the 2 kids. Does this reflect the diversity of families that might make up the learning environment? So is it considering single parent families, children with 2 mums or 2 dads possibly? From a critical pedagogy perspective in the early years, the learning environment, it's a primary source of information about diversity and also gender roles and expectations. Early years environments are where children pick up cues and understandings of how they're supposed to behave and talk, of what they should be interested in, and what they're expected to enjoy. So, in other words, these are places where children's understandings of concepts such as gender develop. Teachers need to reflect critically on their perpetuation of gender stereotypes. So these are often subconsciously reflected in teacher attitudes, in the language that they use, and also in their teaching methods. So this really needs to be critically thought about. And of course, this also is important across primary and secondary, but I guess in terms of child development, the early years are a critical time in developing these kind of understandings. So an example of critical pedagogy, specifically in the early years. So it's also important to note that a critical approach to pedagogy, it doesn't have to link to a controversial topic. It can be embedded in all of our practice. So food education, for example, this is a good example because it's been historically explored using the food pyramid. So focusing on the nutritional value of food, at least it was when I was in school. So critical pedagogies, they can provide a way to address food education, acknowledging it as a social construct, so drawing from experiences within family and community, and also societal context. So this approach, in comparison to that traditional historical approach, this really changes the learning entirely. So some examples might include looking at the branding and advertising of food and how this influences our purchasing, or possibly a connection between food and pleasure, looking at the social and cultural differences. So for example, reflecting on and discussing a series of National Geographic images of what families around the world eat in a week. Gamification could be utilised with the use of the Food Force game, for example. So where players take on missions, they distribute food in a famine-affected country with the aim of helping it to recover and become self-sufficient again. So you can see where I'm going. So food waste, this is another area which could be critically examined. So through organisations such as Second Bite. So this is a community endeavour which rescues surplus food from across the retail network, and it redistributes it to local charities around the country, so providing food relief to people in need. So from these examples, you can see that a critical pedagogy, it's about revealing what is hidden from view. So discussing power, privilege, and the processes that support some people, but equally they disadvantage others. It's also about student transformation. So to actively and critically question what they hear and see, and giving them opportunities to adopt a more activist role in society. So again, an example from EUB104, Jen encouraged you to think critically about the portrayal of teachers in the media, to step into their shoes and to reflect specifically on the processes that support teacher resilience. So to support students in their critical reflections, it's vital that they can share and take on the perspectives of others. Circular viewpoints, it's a learning environment routine commonly used to help students to identify and consider different and diverse perspectives. So this is something, it actually needs to be learned and it needs to be practiced often to support students' critical reflection. While engaging in this thinking, students gain a greater awareness of how others are feeling and thinking. So developing that empathy and understanding. It also encourages or reinforces the understanding that people will think differently about a topic. So everyone has a different perspective. So this kind of routine or activity, it can be used at the beginning of a unit or study or an activity to help students brainstorm new perspectives about a specific topic, and also imagine different characters, different themes, or questions that might be connected to it. It could also be used to brainstorm and problem solve solutions to dilemmas that come up in class. So something that might be specific to a group of children or the whole children. So this is another strategy that you might like to add to your learning companion for your future practice. So moving on to place-based pedagogy. So this describes a pedagogical approach that focuses on the social, economic, and ecological resources of the local community. So at its very heart is the notion of a sense of place and the significance of place in shaping people's or students' identities. So it's of specific relevance to rural and Indigenous communities, so where isolation could lead to a greater need for community connection, and also cohesiveness. It has very strong connections to problem-based learning, to outdoor nature-based learning, and also connections to sustainability. So place-based pedagogy, it's seen to be closely linked to critical pedagogy, I guess because of the focus on democratic approaches to engagement and also to community well-being. So an excellent example of this was what was unpacked in one of our earlier learning forums, so the Legless Lizard Inquiry Project. So this was a community-focused project using place-based pedagogy, so a context relevant to the students' local community. The project was based in local bushland where primary teachers and a visiting artist supported students in the study of the legless lizard using an inquiry-based approach. So the students used critical inquiry and the new understandings to empower them to take action to save the legless lizard. It encouraged students to understand that with knowledge comes power. So the power that enabled them to do something in their moment in time and take a positive and constructive action. So remembering these were prep students. So it's not something that is just focused in the older age groups, it's early childhood as well, this critical inquiry. So we can see this strong connection here between the two pedagogies, the critical pedagogy and the contextual place-based pedagogy. So another example of place-based learning involves the development of a quality early years educational program for children that includes outdoor activities such as exploring natural environments. So the early years learning framework acknowledges the benefits of these natural environments in improving children's learning, their health, and also their well-being. So to meet these needs, some education and care services in Queensland have actually more recently sought to deliver part of their regular kindergarten program in the natural environment. So this has been referred to as bush, beach, or rainforest kindy. So this is really important because these learning environments, they expose children to new experiences and self-directed play. So this is led by their curiosity and again supported by inquiry-based approaches. So children are free to explore, practice new skills and learn new information through this exploration. Again, much like the legless lizard example. So the activities and space, they also give children a renewed connection and appreciation for the natural environment. So again, connected to sustainability. In this secondary example of place-based pedagogy, the approach to teaching and learning is culturally and socially responsive. So it makes connections between the students, content, and the community rather than seeing them as separate and unrelated. In the clip, students explore connections between representations of number and pattern and how they relate to nature and aspects of their own culture. So curriculum and pedagogy are not seen here as separate. So I'd like you to pause the recording and watch and reflect on the connections between student, between content, and also pedagogy. So within a place-based pedagogy, it's acknowledged that children and families should experience an environment where authentic links with the family and the wider world are appreciated, they're affirmed, and also they're extended. So it's important for children and students to develop an understanding of themselves as significant and respected in order to develop pride and strength in their own personal and cultural identity. So this is a big focus of place-based pedagogy. So a place where they feel comfortable with the routines, with the customs, and with regular events. And also where they know the limits and also the boundaries of acceptable behaviour. So you'll be able to make connections here with what you learn and discuss in EUB103, so culture studies, Indigenous education. So there is a focus here on understanding Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's perspectives on history, on contemporary issues, and why Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students continue to be disadvantaged by education systems. So importantly in this unit, it establishes a critical foundation for your teaching practice to support you in meeting the place-based educational needs of Indigenous students, also their families and their communities, so in very practical ways. So the final one that we're going to look at is caring pedagogy. So while academic knowledge and skills are important, students also need to feel respected, understood, appreciated, and cared for to promote growth and learning. In the past, the notion of a caring pedagogy was mostly associated with students with special needs, immigrant and migrant families, or those within early childhood setting. Research emphasises the power of caring relationships in education and also the influence of students' feelings on their ability to learn. In fact, students who perceive their teachers as caring have a better sense of belonging in school and tend to show much more progress when it comes to learning. So a learning environment that reflects a caring pedagogy, this would be one, for example, that has smaller group sizes, minimal competition, where diversity and individual students' needs, strengths, and interests are acknowledged and considered. One where class and student expectations are also collaboratively developed. So those issues of social justice are really part of the daily experiences in the learning environment. So the student is at the heart of all teacher decisions. A caring pedagogy, or I guess more commonly in the early years literature, a pedagogy of care, is very much the basis of early years teaching and learning. In some ways, I would consider that it's the essence of all interactions and considerations in early years learning environments, and of course, the focus of the early years learning framework. In the early years, listening is very much associated with care. So, listening means following the child's lead, recognizing that children learn through co constructing. Importantly, the pedagogy of listening enables us to build those strong and trusting relationships that are so important in education. So it's about actively listening to children and students. And this is something that we all need to be conscious of in our practice, making sure that our students know we're aware of what they're saying, that we're accepting of their perspective, and that we appreciate their contributions and understanding. So active listening skills are skills that you really need to think about and to practice. So things like maintaining eye contact, giving the child, the student, our full attention. Remembering things like not interrupting when they're speaking, and using tools like paraphrasing what they say to make sure that you have the correct understanding. So these are important skills that I think you're going to need to be aware of and practice during your placements. And I think they're also skills that you need to reflect on and add to your teaching companion. So an excellent example of a caring pedagogy within the unit content was the I Wish My Teacher Knew initiative. I'm sure you all remember this one. So the emphasis here was on really developing a good understanding of children and students' strengths, their interests and needs, and acting accordingly. Michelle also last week, one of our guest lecturers, she emphasised the importance of being welcoming and friendly. So extending to secondary environments as well, being welcoming and friendly, making good relationships to get to know students and to understand how to best support them. She stressed that this involved showing that you actually care. And this was way beyond collecting demographic and assessment data. So it's not just about looking up the student on the One School database. It goes way beyond that. So as Michelle outlined, caring can take many forms. So in our online learning environment, it may not be face-to-face, but it certainly involves things like checking in on student wellbeing, providing opportunities for social interactions during social distancing and lockdown, giving feedback, and also things just like being available, whether it be via email or a phone call as necessary. So in this first part of our week 9 lecture, we've unpacked the 4 different pedagogies outlined in the textbook, but it's important to remember that there are many more. It's important to have a good understanding of these core pedagogies so you can identify and explain them when you talk about your practice. And these are going to form the basis of your developing teacher toolkit and your understandings about practice. So with specific strategies and approaches and pedagogies to teaching and learning, you're going to build on these in the next 4 years as you go into your placements. So as your personal beliefs about practice evolve, you're going to interweave many other pedagogies, with some becoming more significant to you than others. So this will depend on your values and your own beliefs and your life histories as well. So these will also be influenced by the community and also the context of your future learning environments, and also the many families and students within that environment. So you have many other pedagogies to consider, and these are going to be introduced as you move into second, third, and fourth year. Okay, thank you everyone. I'll see you in part 2.